In this tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural avocado skin material in Blender. If you'd like to help support the channel and purchase the material, then you can get that over on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. Links are in the description. And as you may know, I do create a lot of procedural material tutorials. And so every time I create another 10 procedural materials, I compile them together into a Blender procedural material pack. And so I have just released Blender procedural material pack number 10. And I have 10 procedural materials in each procedural material pack, and so this avocado material is my 100th procedural material. So if you'd like to check out my procedural material packs, I'll have the links in the description to where you can purchase them on my Gumroad store. And purchasing the packs is a great way to help support this channel, as well as getting some material assets for your 3D work. And you can also check out my Blender procedural food pack if you'd like to purchase some of my food materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my 100 Blender procedural materials, then you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube, where I show you how to create all of my procedural materials. So before we create the procedural material, I did just want to show you what I have set up in the 3D space if you want to set it up the same way that I have. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go here to Mesh, and I'm going to add an icosphere. And then before you click away or move the icosphere, right behind me, you can click on that little Add Icosphere setting. And on the subdivisions here, I'm going to turn this up to a 6 because I want it to be very subdivided, and then I can just click on the arrow to close this. And I want this to be very subdivided because I am going to be using the displacements in the node editor to actually displace the mesh, and so I do want very detailed topology so that the displacements can actually displace the mesh and make it kind of bumpy. And then using the object context menu, I can shade this smooth. So I'm going to use this to model a basic avocado, and then we'll apply the material to it. So how I modeled the avocado is I just pressed the tab key to go into edit mode, and then you can press the O key, or you can click on this button right here, and this is going to turn on the proportional editing. So I can now just select a vertex on the top, and I can press G to grab, and then I can hit Z to bring it up on the Z axis, and I'm going to scroll with my scroll wheel to just pull along more of the vertices. And that is the feature of the proportional editing. It's going to pull along vertices nearby it. I could also hit S to scale, kind of scale the whole thing up a little bit on the top there, and then kind of bring down the top and maybe scroll with my mouse wheel to bring that down. I could also do the same thing for the bottom here, so I could press G to grab, bring the bottom down, and then press G to grab again and bring it up on the Z axis, but this time I can bring my scroll wheel down to make the proportional editing smaller so it's a bit more flat. And then also I could just select some parts here and kind of bring them out to the side, and also just make it a bit more random because avocados are just a little bit bumpy and a little bit random. So I'm just going to select some of the vertices here and press G to grab and kind of move them around just so that it's a bit more organic and random and natural. And then I think I also might want to flatten the top a bit, so I will actually select a vertex on the top here, and I'm going to scale it on the Z axis and just flatten the top a little bit, and maybe even bring in the sides a little bit. Bring in the sides here, something like that, so that it's a bit more the shape of an avocado. And then I also like previewing the procedural material on a sphere, so I'm going to press Shift A, and I'm going to add another icosphere, and this icosphere has the subdivision of 6 levels, so I can press G to grab, move this over here, and I'm just going to place it behind the avocado. And I'll also scale it up a little bit so it's a bit bigger. And then to keep the scale of the procedural materials consistent between the two objects, once I've scaled this up, I'm going to hold down the Shift key and select both objects, and I can press Control A, and I'm going to apply the scale. And then also this object here, I need to shade it smooth with the object context menu. And then I also added a camera here, and I just pointed the camera at the objects. And then to make everything look a little bit more flat, if you click on the camera and go to the camera settings, I turned the focal length up to 80 just so that it looks a bit more flat. And then also to get some nice lighting, I added in these 3 rim lights here. So if you press Shift A, you can go down here to light, and you can add the area light. And so I put these area lights behind the objects, and I gave them a very slight blue color, and then I also changed the shape to rectangle, and I changed the X size here to make them kind of long. And I also turned up the power so that they're pretty strong. And this is going to give some nice blue rim lighting on the side of the objects. And then to get a nice bright main light, I added another light here, and this one I turned the shape to an ellipse, and I turned the power way up to 3000, and also on the color here I made it kind of a slightly yellow color, but mostly mostly white. And I pointed this down from the right side, pointed down at the objects to get some nice bright lighting. And then also to get some realistic lighting and reflections, right over here on the world properties, I added in this Whipple Creek Gazebo 1K HDRI. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com. I'll have the link in the description if you'd like to download this. So if you go to the world properties, you can click on the yellow dot here next to color, and you can click on environment texture, and then you can click on the open button, and then you can open up the downloaded HDRI. And then if you want to make the background transparent so you can't see the HDRI in the background, if you go here to the render properties, you can open up the film tab right here, and then you can click on the transparent check mark right there to make the background transparent. So there's the HDRI, but I can just click on transparent to make the background transparent. And then also to make the lighting and colors just a little bit nicer, right over here on the render properties, if you open up the color management, I'm going to be using the view transform of Filmic, and then I'm going to make the look here high contrast. And the high contrast is going to make things more contrasty, and it'll also make the colors a bit more saturated and look a bit nicer. So now let's go over the displacement settings. So I am going to be using the Cycles rendering engine because the Eevee rendering engine won't support the displacements. So if you want to use the displacements right here on the render properties, you need to make sure you're in the Cycles rendering engine. And then if you want to add even more detail, you could go right here to the modifier properties, and you could click on add modifier and add the subdivision surface modifier, and that's going to basically subdivide the mesh so the material will have even more geometry to work with. But these objects are already pretty detailed, they have a lot of geometry, so this amount of detail will work fine for what I'm doing. So now we need to create a new material. So select one of the objects here, and I'm in the shading workspace, so I have the 3D space right here, and then I have the shader editor right over here. So I'm going to click on the new button to add a new material, and I can just rename the material. Now there is one more really important displacement setting that we need to turn on. So if you click right over here to go to the material properties, you can open up the settings tab right here, and under surface on the displacement right here, we want to change this from bump only to displacement and bump. And this is going to tell the material that it can use the displacement. And then also right here on the material drop down, I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to drop this avocado material onto the other object as well, so they both have the same material. And then before we get started creating the procedural material, I am going to be using the Node Wrangler add-on. So if you don't have the add-on enabled, you can click here on edit, and you can open up the preferences, and then over there on the add-ons tab, you can just search for Node Wrangler and checkmark the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So to start off, I want to create some little dots all around the avocado. So to do this, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the Voronoi texture. Let's drop the Voronoi down here, and then using the feature of the Node Wrangler, I can hold down the Control and Shift key and then select different nodes. And by holding down the Control and Shift key and selecting different nodes, it's going to plug the wire up to the surface of the material output, and so we can preview what the node is looking like on the object. And then with the Voronoi texture selected, I'm also going to press Control T, and that is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. Now we don't actually need the mapping node, so I'm going to press X to delete it. And then let's take the object, and we're going to put the object up to the vector. And I'm using the object coordinates because the object coordinates will place the Voronoi texture on the object more evenly. And then you can see that there's a little bit of sharpness in between those dots there, and I want to make that smooth. So if you click on the F1 right here, I'm going to change this instead to smooth F1. And so this is going to smooth out those edges which are around the circles. Now let's also change the scale here because I want more of those circles. So I'm going to turn the scale here to a 23, and that way there's going to be a lot more of those little dots. Now these dots are very round and smooth, and I want to make them look a bit more organic and natural. So I'm going to be adding in a noise texture, and we're going to use the noise texture to distort the placement of the Voronoi. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture, and let's drop this right up here. And then to preview it, you can hold down the Control and Shift key and select the noise texture. And then again, I want to use the object coordinates, so let's pull out a wire from the object, and we're going to put that into the vector. So now let's change some of the noise texture settings. So on the scale here, I'm just going to turn this up to 12. And then I also want to make this very detailed. So let's turn the detail all the way to the max of 15. And then let's add a little bit more roughness here. So on the roughness value, I'm just going to turn this to a 0.55. So there's a bit more roughness. All right, so this noise texture is going to distort the placement of the Voronoi. So to add this into the vector here, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the Mix RGB, and we're going to drop the Mix RGB node right here between the texture coordinate and the Voronoi. And I can just click and drag to box select these and bring them over. So I can now use the Mix RGB to mix two values together. So I'm going to take the color here from the noise texture and I'm going to put that into color 2. And then the object coordinates is going to go into color 1. So then I can control shift and select the Voronoi texture to preview what it's doing. So you can see the noise texture is now distorting the Voronoi, and so it looks all noisy. And if we change the factor, that's going to change how much of the noise texture it's actually using. So if I turn the factor all the way to 0, it's just using the object coordinates, which is color 1. But as I turn the factor up, it's going to use more and more of color 2, which is the noise texture. And so as we turn the factor up, it's going to distort it more and more. Now you can see that when I drag this, it's kind of moving the texture around. So to make it so it's not moving it around, I can click on the mix here, and I'm going to change this to linear light. This way I can drag the factor and it's going to distort it, but the texture won't be moving around quite as much. Now I only want the noise texture to distort the Voronoi just a little bit. So I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.04, just a 0.04, and that way it's going to be very subtle. So you can see the dots are still there. It's mostly the Voronoi texture, but if you zoom in closely, you can see that there's just a little bit of noise around those dots and it's distorting it a little bit. So now it looks much more organic and natural. Now I want to make this more contrasty because it is pretty gray, and I want these lighter parts around the dots to be brighter. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the color ramp node, and I'm going to stick this right here after the Voronoi texture. I can also box select these and bring them back a bit. And then make sure you control shift and select the color ramp to preview it. So I can now click on the white tab and I can drag this over towards the black tab. You can see as I drag it over, the texture is now more and more contrasty. So I'm just going to drag it to about here so that it's mostly white, but then there's those little black areas. So I'm going to pull out a wire here from the color, and I'm going to stick this into the base color of the principled shader, and then I can control shift and select the principled shader to preview it. Now that obviously doesn't look like an avocado because an avocado is kind of green and brown, so I want to change the colors. So to do that, I can click on the color ramp right here, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and then I can drop the color ramp right here after the first one. So now we can change the colors of this color ramp, and that'll actually change the colors for the base color. So I'm first going to select the color ramp, and then I'm going to hit the backspace, and that is going to clear or reset the color ramp. So I'm going to click on this black tab right here, click on the color, and I want to make this a bit brighter, and then it's going to be a green color. So it's going to be a very dark green. And if you want to use the same exact color that I'm using for this dark green color, if you go over to the hex value, you can punch in a hex value of 12260F. So that is the green color that I'll be using. And you can see it's adding little green dots there. And then I want the rest of the avocado to be a dark brown. So I'm going to click on this white tab right here and click on the color. And I'm going to make this a orangey color, and then I'm going to make it very dark. And that's going to make it a dark brown. And again, if you want to use the same exact color that I'm using, over here on the hex value, you can punch in a hex value of 161009. So there we go, we now have the color for the avocado. Now I also want to plug this color ramp here into the roughness so that some parts are a bit more rough and other parts are a bit more shiny. So let's pull out a wire here from the color, and I'm going to stick that into the roughness. Now I want more control over this because you can see it's way too shiny in some areas and then way too rough in other areas. So I'm going to select this top color ramp here, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's just drop it right down here. And then I want to reset the color ramp. So again, with this color ramp selected, I'm going to hit the backspace and that'll reset it. Now for this black tab right here, I want to make this a bit brighter because you can see if I make the values brighter, it's going to be more and more rough. But if I make it darker, it's going to be more shiny. So I want to make the whole thing a bit more rough, so I'll turn this up a bit. And then I'm also going to click on the white tab, and this is way too rough here. So on the white tab, I'm going to drag this down a bit, and this is going to make it much more shiny. And if you want to use the same exact values that I'm using over here on this lighter colored tab, if you click on the color, I'm going to be using a hex value of BD, BD, BD. And then over here on the other side on this darker gray color, it is a slightly darker gray. For this color, I'm going to be using a hex value of 9A, 9A, 9A. So now if you zoom in here, you can see some parts are a little bit more rough, whereas other parts are a bit more shiny. Now to make this avocado look a bit more organic and natural, and to make it look more like food, I do want to add a little bit of subsurface scattering. And the subsurface scattering will allow a little bit of light to go through the material. So right here on the principled shader, on the subsurface value, I'm going to turn this to a 0.04, just a 0.04. So it is a very subtle amount of subsurface. So it'll just be a tiny little bit of subsurface, but it will make it look a bit more organic and natural and make it look a bit more like food. And then I also want to change the subsurface color right here because I don't want it to be white. So I'm going to click on the color here, and I'm going to make it a green color, and then I'm going to make it very dark. And for the subsurface color, if you want to use the same value that I'm using, if you click here on the color and go to the hex value, I'm going to be using a hex value of 203000. So it's basically just a dark green color and slightly towards the yellow. Now this avocado is very smooth, and I do want to make it pretty rough on the surface because avocados are pretty rough and bumpy. And also those little dots there on the avocado need to be popping out. So let's take this color ramp here after the Voronoi. We're going to pull out a wire here from the color, and let's stick this into the normal to give it some bump. Now you can see there's some really weird shading issues, and this is because this is color data, but then this is normal data. So we need a node in here to convert the color data into normal data. So to do this, I can press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the bump node, and let's drop the bump node right in here between the color ramp and the normal. And then to actually convert this to normal data, we want to put this into the height value. And now it's actually converting it to normal data, and you can see the avocado looks very bumpy. Now you can see the bumps are going back in, and I instead want them to be popping out. So I can click on this invert button to pop them out. And then they are way too strong, so I want to make them more subtle. So we can turn the strength value down to make them less strong. And I'm going to turn the strength value to a 0.13, just a 0.13, so they are pretty subtle. And we're also going to be putting these values into the displacement to actually pop out the mesh. Now I do also want to add some noisy bump all over the material because you can see in between these dots or these circles, it is still very smooth. So I'm going to select the bump node here, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to stick it after the first bump. So the normal can go through the normal of this bump, but we now have this extra height value that we can add data into. So I'm going to take the factor from this noise texture, and let's put this into the height value of the second bump. And now you can see it's giving some nice bump all over the avocado. And I'm going to turn off the invert button so that it's not inverted. And I do want it to be a little bit more subtle. So let's just turn the strength value to 0.1 on the second bump. So this is looking really cool, and it's definitely looking like an avocado skin, but I still want to add some normal into the displacement. Now, if you don't want to use the displacement, that's totally fine. You could just finish off the procedural material here, but I do want to add the displacement just to make it a little bit bumpy and make it look a bit more realistic. So what I'm going to do is press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I want to search for a noise texture. Let's click on this noise texture, and I'm going to drop this down here underneath the other noise texture. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And then let's take the object here from the texture coordinate, and we're going to put that into the vector just like the other procedural textures. And then let's change some of the values here. So I'm going to turn the scale to like a value of 8, and then I do want it to be very detailed, so let's turn the detail all the way to the max of 15. And then I do want to add a bit more roughness, so let's turn the roughness value to a 0.55. So we are going to put this noise texture into the displacement to give it some noisy bump. And then we will also be mixing in the Voronoi texture so that those little dots pop out as well. Now I want to make this noise texture more contrasty, so I'm just going to select any color ramp right here, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's drop it in the wire here after this noise texture. And then make sure you Control Shift and select the color ramp so that you can preview it. And then with the color ramp selected, again, I can hit the backspace and that will reset the color ramp. So I want to make this noise darker and more contrasty. So I'm going to click on this black tab and I'm going to drag the black tab out a bit so it's a bit darker. And then I'm also going to click on the white tab here and click on this color. And I'm going to make this kind of a dark gray. And the hex value that I'll be using for this dark gray is going to be 717171. All right, so I now want to put this color ramp here into the displacement, and then we'll also be mixing the Voronoi texture into it. So I'm going to take the color here from the color ramp and let's stick that into the displacement of the material output. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. Now you can see it is doing something, but it looks really weird. It's kind of just like jutting off to the side, and that is because this is color data, but then this is displacement data. So we need to put a node in here to convert the color data into displacement data. So to do this, I can press Shift A and let's go here to the search, and I can search for the displacement node, and I'm going to stick this here in the wire going into the displacement, and then I can just like drag it down and I'm going to bring it here underneath the principled shader. And then you can see now it's not really doing anything. It's kind of just bringing the objects over to the side. So I actually want to take the color here from this color ramp and I want to put this into the height value, and that's going to convert it to displacement data. So now it is working, but the displacement is way too strong. So I'm going to turn the scale value way down and I'm going to turn the scale value to like a 0.1 so it's much less strong. So now that noise texture that we added into the displacement is just giving a little bit of bump on the edges. But I do also want to mix in the Voronoi texture. So what I'm going to do is press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for the Mix RGB node, and I want to drop the Mix RGB right here between the displacement and the color ramp. So the Mix RGB will allow us to mix two colors together, so we can now take the color ramp color, and I'm going to plug this into color 2 of this mix here. And then this color ramp here from this noise texture is going to be going into color 1. And then just to preview what it's doing, I can Control Shift and select the mix shader to preview it. So if I turn the factor all the way up to 1, it's just going to use the dots. But then if I drag the factor all the way down to 0, it's just going to use the noise. So I mostly want to use the noise, but I just want to add a little bit of the dots. So I'm going to turn the factor value to a 0.1. And this way, it's a nice mix between the Voronoi dots and the noise. So I can now Control Shift and select the principled shader. Now there is a problem. If you zoom in here, you can see the dots are now going back in, but I instead want them to pop out. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for an invert node. Let's click on the invert node, and I want to drop this in here after the Mix RGB. So the invert node is going to invert the values, so the white is going to be black and the black is going to be white. And you can see now that those little dots there are actually being popped out of the mesh. And that is it. So that is the Procedural Avocado Skin Material. So I'll just give this a final render. So thank you so much for watching this tutorial, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you'd like to help support me and this channel and purchase this procedural material, then you can do that over on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs, and I've also just released Blender procedural material pack number 10, so you can check that out with the link in the description. And you can also check out my Blender procedural food pack if you'd like to purchase some food materials. Or if you'd like to learn how to create any of my 100 procedural materials, then you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist with the link in the description. And I'm always working on new procedural materials, so there will be lots more procedural materials in the future. But that's it for this tutorial, so I hope you found this helpful, and thank you for watching.